Detroit didn't just lose buildings here. It lost an entire neighborhood. Homes, churches, corner stores, schools, businesses, front porches, family kitchens, streets where people knew each other. A place where thousands of Detroiters lived ordinary lives. Until one of the most powerful companies in America needed land. This was Poletown. And in the early 1980s, Detroit made a decision that still sparks arguments more than 40 years later. The city cleared hundreds of acres for one promise: jobs. Some people saw it as a painful price of saving Detroit's auto industry. Others saw it as a neighborhood sacrificed for a corporation. And now, standing here decades later, with the factory still here, the house is gone, the church is gone, and the story still unsettled, we have to ask the uncomfortable question: was it worth it? This is History Loves Company, and today we're walking through the Detroit neighborhood that disappeared for General Motors. Detroit is a city where the past is never really gone. You feel it in the streets. You see it in the buildings. You hear it in the way people talk about places that technically do not exist anymore. Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, the old Hudsons, Tiger Stadium, Dodge, Main, and Poletown. Some places disappear from the map long before they disappear from memory. Poletown is one of those places. Today, most people drive past this area and see industry. They see fencing. They see trucks. They see a massive auto plant. They see the kind of landscape Detroit is known for: manufacturing, infrastructure, concrete, steel. But before all of this was a neighborhood. A real neighborhood. Not an abstract planning map. Not an empty space waiting for a factory. Not just acreage. People lived here. They worshipped here. They worked here. They opened businesses here. They walked to church here. They sent their kids to school here. They grew up here. And then Detroit-Hamtramck and General Motors made a deal. A deal that would become one of the most controversial uses of eminent domain in American history. Because the city did not just buy land. It used the power of the government to take land. And that land was then cleared for a private corporation, General Motors. That is what makes this story so complicated. Because this is not just a story about Detroit losing a neighborhood. It is a story about what cities do when they are desperate. It is a story about jobs, power, memory, progress, survival, and sacrifice. And depending on who you ask, Poletown was either the necessary cost of keeping Detroit alive, or one of the biggest mistakes that this city ever made. Before Poletown became a case study, before it became a legal milestone, before it became a symbol of urban removal, it was a place. And that matters, because once a neighborhood is gone, people start talking about it like it was just a project, just a site, just a development zone, just a plant footprint. But neighborhoods are not footprints. They're lives stacked on top of each other. They're the grocery store where somebody knew your order, the church basement where someone had their wedding shower, the bar where workers stopped after a shift, the school hallway where somebody met their first friend, the front porch where grandparents watched the block, the corner where kids learned to ride bikes, the smell of dinner coming through open windows in summer, the sound of bells, the sound of factories, the sound of Detroit being Detroit. Poletown sat in northeast Detroit near Hamtramck. Its name came from the Polish community that had helped shape it, but by the 1980s arrived, Poletown was more than one ethnicity, and more than one story. It was Polish, it was African American, it was immigrant, it was working class, it was Catholic churches, small businesses, modest homes, and generations of families living in the shadow of Detroit's industrial machine. And that is important, because this neighborhood was not isolated from Detroit's bigger history. Some of the people who ended up in and around Poletown had already seen displacement before. Some families had watched Black Bottom and Paradise Valley disappear for highways and urban renewal. So for some Detroiters, this was not the first time a neighborhood that had been taken in the name of progress. It was another chapter in a longer story. And that is one of the painful truths about Detroit. Some communities did not just lose one neighborhood. They lost them again and again. Not always in the same way, not always for the same reason, but always with the same result. The map changed, and the people had to move. Poletown was dense. It was lived in. It had churches, it had businesses, it had homes. It had blocks where people knew who belonged and who was new. And for a long time, that kind of neighborhood was the backbone of Detroit. Working people lived near the places that employed them. Auto plants were not far away industrial parks. They were part of the rhythm of the city. You could live near the factory. You could hear it. You could smell it. You could build your life around it. And just across the way, one of the most important factories in the area was Dodge Main. Dodge Main helped define Hamtramck in this part of Detroit. It was massive. It was powerful. It was the kind of place that made the Motor City the Motor City. But by 1980, Dodge Main was closed. And when a giant factory closes in a city built around factories, the impact is not just economic. It's emotional. It's psychological. It sends a message. The world is changing. The old Detroit is cracking. And the people in power were terrified of what might come next. To understand Poletown, you have to understand the fear of moment. This was not a decision made in Detroit that felt rich, comfortable, and stable. This was a decision made in a Detroit that felt cornered. The auto industry was changing. Jobs were disappearing. Factories were closing. People were leaving the city. The tax base was shrinking. And Detroit was fighting to hold on to the identity that built it. The Motor City. That phrase sounds romantic now, but at the time, it was also pressure. If Detroit could not keep auto jobs, what was Detroit? If the plants left, what would happen to the neighborhoods? What would happen to the city budget? What would happen to the workers? What would happen to the future? This is the part of the story where it becomes too easy to simplify everyone. It is easy to say the city was wrong. It is easy to say that GM was powerful. It is easy to say the residents were victims, and there is truth in that. But history is usually more painful than a clean headline, because the city was making a decision under pressure. Detroit leaders wanted jobs. They wanted investment. They wanted to keep General Motors in the city. They wanted to prove that Detroit could still compete. And General Motors wanted a modern plant. A large site. A site big enough for the kind of manufacturing it believed it needed. A site that could support a new future for the company. And the area chosen was Poletown. The land needed for the project was enormous. 465 acres, 1,500 homes, 144 businesses, 16 churches. Think about that. Do not let the numbers pass by too quickly. 1,500 homes. That is not just 1,500 structures. That is 1,500 versions of home. 1,500 kitchens, 1,500 sets of keys, 1,500 front doors, 1,500 addresses people had memorized, written on forms, given to relatives, printed on mail, and built their lives around. 144 businesses. That is not just storefronts. That is owners, customers, workers, savings, risk, dreams, the small places that hold a neighborhood together. And 16 churches. In Detroit, churches are not just buildings. They are archives. They are community centers. They are baptism records, wedding photos, funerals, fish fries, choirs, basements, mothers, grandmothers, whole lives. And all of that was placed in a path of a factory. The promise was jobs. The promise was tax revenue. The promise was that this sacrifice would help Detroit survive. And this is where the question begins. How much of the past do you destroy to buy a future?
This isn't just another real estate platform. This is something different. A place where every property has a story. Search with ease, but discover more than just location and price. Every space comes with context, history, and identity. You don't just see a home, you understand it. Want to sell? Create a listing that stands out by telling what makes your place unique. Save, share, and connect with people who value more than just square footage. We don't just sell homes. We take care of preserving and telling their story. Because every home has a story, let's discover yours. History loves company.
In 1980, the city and General Motors struck a deal. The plant would be built. The land would be cleared. The government would use eminent domain, and Poletown would be removed. Eminent domain is the power of government to take private property for public use, usually with compensation. Most people understand it when the project is clearly public. A road, a bridge, a school, a public building. But Poletown was different, because the land was being taken for a General Motors plant, a private company. The argument was that the public benefit would be jobs, tax revenue, and economic development. In other words, the city believed that helping GM build this plant served a public purpose because of what the plant would bring. And in a city desperate for work, that argument carried weight. Some residents accepted buyouts. Some moved. Some may have seen the writing on the wall. Some may have believed the fight was already lost. Some may have needed the money. Some may have wanted out. But not everyone agreed, because for the people who did not want to leave, this was not just a transaction. This was home. And that is the difference between a planner looking at a map and a family looking at a front door. On a map, a neighborhood can look like land. In real life, it is memory. It is identity. It is the place where your life happened. The city could offer money, but money does not replace the church where your parents were married. Money does not replace the block where everyone knew your name. Money does not replace the house your father fixed with his own hands. Money does not replace the feeling of belonging somewhere. And that is why some residents fought. A Poletown neighborhood council formed. The battle became public. The story drew attention far beyond Detroit. And eventually, the fight went to the Michigan Supreme Court. The question was bigger than one neighborhood. Could government take private property from residents and businesses, then transfer that land for a private company's economic development project? Could jobs count as public use? Could a promise of economic growth justify the removal of an entire neighborhood? In 1981, the Michigan Supreme Court said yes. And once that happened, the legal fight that mattered most was over. But the human fight was not. Every story like this has a place where the larger conflict becomes painfully human. In Poletown, one of those places was Immaculate Conception Church. Churches are powerful in these stories because they make the loss visible. You can talk about acreage and industrial development all day. You can talk about job numbers, tax revenue, modern manufacturing, plant design, economic pressure. But when you get to a church, the story changes. Because a church carries the emotional evidence of a neighborhood. It holds the rituals of people's lives. The baptisms, the weddings, the confessions, the funerals, the Christmas services, the Easter mornings, the Sunday habits, the candles, the songs, the people who sat in the same pew for decades. And when a church is slated to be demolished, people feel that loss differently. Residents and supporters fought. They staged demonstrations. They staged sit-ins. They tried to force the city, GM, and the public to see Poletown not as vacant land, but as a community. There was a 29-day sit-in at Immaculate Conception. 29 days. Imagine that. Imagine sitting inside a church, knowing that outside those walls, the machinery of government, law, and industry is moving forward. Imagine believing that if you stay long enough, if you make people look long enough, maybe someone will stop it. Maybe someone will change their mind. Maybe the building will stand. Maybe the neighborhood will survive. But that's not what happened. The protesters were removed. The wrecking ball came, and Poletown disappeared. This is the part of the story that hurts because it shows the limits of memory when power has already decided. The people remembered what the neighborhood was. The city saw what the land could become, and the land won. Or maybe the city won. Or maybe GM won. Or maybe nobody won cleanly at all. That's why Poletown still bothers people. Because even if you understand the argument for the plant, you cannot stand here and pretend that nothing was lost. Something was lost. A lot was lost. The question is whether the future that replaced it was worth the price. The Detroit-Hamtramck Assembly Center opened in 1985. It was supposed to represent the future. A modern plant, a major investment, a way to keep manufacturing in Detroit, a way to hold on to jobs in a city where jobs were disappearing. And to be fair, the plant did bring work. It did produce vehicles. It did become part of Detroit's industrial story. It did keep a major General Motors presence in the city. And that matters. Because if you're going to tell this story honestly, you cannot pretend that jobs do not matter. Because they do. Especially in Detroit. A job is not just a number. A job is a mortgage payment, a grocery bill, a car note, a kid's school clothes, a retirement, a union card, a sense of dignity. And in a city that had watched so many jobs disappear, the promise of thousands of jobs was powerful. But the original promise was much bigger than what arrived. The plant was promoted as a source of up to 6,000 jobs, but automation meant the number of jobs was much lower than that. And that is one of the key lessons of Poletown. The city sacrificed a physical neighborhood for an industrial future that was already changing. The factory came, but the old world of manufacturing did not come back the way that people imagined. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Detroit, because cities all over America have made similar choices. They've cleared neighborhoods, offered subsidies, moved residents, changed laws, rebuilt infrastructure, all for the promise of jobs. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. Sometimes it works for a while, and sometimes it works for one group and hurts another. Sometimes the math looks good on paper and feels terrible on the ground. And sometimes the people who pay the highest price are not the people who receive the greatest benefit. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because Poletown asks us to measure things that are hard to measure. How do you compare a job to a home? How do you compare tax revenue to a church? How do you compare a factory to a neighborhood? How do you compare the future of a city to the memory of the people who had to leave? There is no easy answer, and anyone who tells you there is probably has not sat with the story long enough. Here's one of the most haunting parts of the story. Years later, Michigan changed course. In 2004, the Michigan Supreme Court reversed the legal logic that had allowed the Poletown taking. The court ruled in another case that taking property for a business or technology park did not qualify as a valid public use under the Michigan Constitution. In plain English, Michigan looked back at the kind of legal standard that Poletown represented and said, no, that went too far. But by then, Poletown was already gone. That is the line that stays with me. The court changed its mind, but Poletown was already gone. You can change a law. You can reverse a precedent. You can put up a historical marker. You can write articles. You can teach the case in law schools. You can debate it in documentaries. But you cannot put the neighborhood back. That is the tragedy of decisions like this. History can admit a mistake long after the people who suffered from it have already paid the price. And that does not mean that every person involved was evil. It does not mean that every supporter of the plant had bad intentions. It does not mean the city was not facing real pressure. It means the consequences were permanent. That is what we have to respect. When a neighborhood is destroyed, the apology comes too late. When the homes are gone, the court reversal cannot rebuild them. When the churches are gone, the legal lesson cannot ring the bells again. When the streets are erased, the people who once lived there become the last living map. And that is why stories like this need to be told while people still remember. Now we come to the modern chapter. The plant that replaced Poletown did not stay frozen in the 1980s. It kept changing because the auto industry kept changing. In 2020, General Motors announced a major transformation of the Detroit-Hamtramck Assembly Center, a $2.2 billion investment, a retooling for electric vehicles, a new name, Factory Zero. Zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion. That was the vision. And on paper, it sounded like another future, another reinvention, another chapter in Detroit's long relationship with the auto industry. The same land that had once been cleared for a modern 1980s assembly plant was now being used to chase the electric vehicle future. And that is powerful, because this site has now been tied to two different versions of Detroit's industrial hope. In the 1980s, the hope was to keep the auto industry here. In the 2020s, the hope was to make Detroit a major player in the EV future. Once again, the promise was jobs. Once again, the promise was investment. Once again, the future was being sold through manufacturing. But recent layoffs and production adjustments at Factory Zero have made the old question feel current again. Not because the plan is meaningless. Not because EVs are meaningless. Not because manufacturing does not matter. But because Poletown was never only about one factory. It was about trust. It It was about promises. It was about what a city gives up when it believes a company can save it. And that question has not disappeared. It is still here, right here, on this land. The neighborhood is gone. The plant remains. The industry keeps changing. The promises keep changing. And Detroit keeps being asked to believe in the next future. So now we have to come back to the question, was it worth it? And I think the most honest answer is, it depends what you measure. If you measure survival, maybe some people say yes. Detroit was desperate. The auto industry mattered. Jobs mattered. Keeping GM in the city mattered. Tax revenue mattered. Manufacturing mattered. You can make that argument. And many people did. If you measure community, the answer looks different. A neighborhood was erased. Families were moved. Churches were demolished. Businesses vanished. People lost the places that held their memories. You can make that argument too. And many people did. If you measure the legal legacy, the answer becomes even more complicated. Poletown expanded the power of eminent domain in Michigan. Then, years later, that standard was reversed. The law eventually moved away from Poletown, but the neighborhood could not come back. If you measure jobs, the answer is complicated again. The promise was thousands of jobs. The reality was fewer than promised. The plant operated. It produced vehicles. It employed people. But automation and industry changes meant the dream was never as simple as the sales pitch. And if you measure memory, then the answer is painful. Because memory is where cities often fail. Detroit remembers big names, big companies, big buildings, big mayors, big projects. But the people who lived on the smaller streets, the people whose homes were taken, the businesses that closed, the churches that disappeared, those stories can fade unless someone keeps telling them. That is what I believe channels like this are supposed to do. Not just show you what is beautiful, not just show you what is abandoned, not just show you what changed, but ask you what the change cost. Because progress is not automatically wrong. Cities have to grow. They have to adapt. They have to make hard decisions. But when we call something progress, we should also ask, progress for who? Paid for by who? Remembered by who? And forgotten by who? Poletown forces that question. It does not let Detroit off easy. It does not let GM off easy. It does not let preservationists off easy. It does not let any of us off easy. Because if you love Detroit, you have to be willing to tell the full story. Not just the comeback. Not just the decline. Not just the ruins. Not just the ribbon cuttings. The full story. And the full story is that this city has built incredible things, but it has also erased incredible things. Sometimes for highways. Sometimes for stadiums. Sometimes for hospitals. Sometimes for factories. Sometimes for projects that promise the future. And every time, someone was told to move. Someone was told it was necessary. Someone was told the sacrifice would be worth it. Sometimes, maybe it was. Sometimes, maybe it wasn't. But either way, the people who were asked to sacrifice deserve to be remembered. I do not think the lesson of Poletown is simple. I do not think the lesson is never build anything. That's too easy. Detroit needs investment. Detroit needs jobs. Detroit needs industry. Detroit needs new ideas. Detroit needs future-facing projects. And Detroit cannot become a museum of itself. But I also do think the lesson is, anything is acceptable if the project is big enough. And that's dangerous, because once you decide a neighborhood is expendable, you can justify almost anything. You can call it blight. You can call it progress. You can call it economic development. You can call it necessary. And sometimes those words may be partly true, but they can also hide the human cost. The lesson of Poletown is that cities need to be careful with desperation, because desperation makes people accept deals they might question in a stronger moment. Desperation makes promises sound bigger than they are. Desperation makes the future feel more important than the people standing in the way of it. And Detroit has had a lot of desperate moments. That is part of why this city's history is so intense. Detroit has been America's industrial engine, America's cautionary tale, America's comeback story, America's symbol of urban decline, America's symbol of resilience, all at the same time. But in every version of the story, there were real people living inside the headline. Poletown was real people, and the best way to honor them is not to freeze Detroit in the past. It's to remember that the past had people in it. People who mattered. People whose homes mattered. People whose churches mattered. People whose businesses mattered. People whose memories should not disappear just because the land became useful to someone else. Standing here now, it is easy to see the factory. It is harder to see the neighborhood. That is what time does. It covers over the evidence. It changes the landscape. It makes one generation's trauma look like another generation's normal. Someone born after Poletown was cleared could drive by here every day and not even know what was lost. They might never know about the homes, the churches, the businesses, the fight, the sit-ins, the court case, the families, the anger, the hope, the promise, the disappointment. They might just see a plant, but under every plant, every freeway, every stadium, every redevelopment site, every cleared block, there is usually an older story. And in Detroit, those older stories matter, because this city was not built by corporations alone. It was built by workers, families, immigrants, migrants, church ladies, shop owners, auto workers, teachers, kids on bikes, people on porches, people who made neighborhoods feel like home. Poletown is gone, but gone does not have to mean forgotten. So I want to turn this comment section into an archive. If your family lived in Poletown, tell us the street. If you worked at Dodge Main, tell us what you remember. If you worked at the GM plant, tell us what it meant to your family. If you worshipped at one of the churches, tell us what it felt like. If your parents or grandparents talked about Poletown, leave their story here, because neighborhoods disappear twice. First, when the building comes down, and again, when people stop talking about them. This was Poletown, a Detroit neighborhood sacrificed for a promise. And more than 40 years later, we are still asking, was it worth it? I'm Chris Hubble. This is History Loves Company. Every place has a story. Let's keep telling them. And if you love Detroit history, preservation, old stories, old buildings, and the pieces of the city that still survive, come see me at the Foundry by History Loves Company in downtown Pontiac. We're building a place for storytellers, small businesses, creators, collectors, and people who believe that history still matters. Find me at the Foundry.